Hi, everyone. Welcome to Celebrating Aviation with Mike Mashat. Remember those quizzes in school where you'd get a question like, compare and contrast these two airplanes? Yeah, right. Well, we're going to do that today with direction sheets from Revell and Monogram. Let's take a look at the difference between the two corporate philosophies. The kits I've chosen are the American Airlines Boeing 707 jet flagship and Monogram's Lockheed Super G Constellation. Notice that both these airplanes are shown on the ground with people deplaning as opposed to being in flight. Thought that was kind of interesting. Well, let's start with the 707, a little history first. The model 367-80, or the Dash 80 as it was referred to, the one-of-a-kind jet transport prototype, first flew in 1954, shown here over what's affectionately referred to as Mount Boeing, Mount Rainier. And just a revolutionary, world-changing airplane. This brought the jet age to commercial transportation and cut travel times by 50% on every route around the world. That airplane evolved into the KC-135 Strato tanker, a jet tanker for the Strategic Air Command to refuel the new jet bombers that were happening. And this airplane first flew in 1956. So here's Revell's kit of the KC-135. And I start with this because the 707 emerged from the KC-135 in both model form and in real life. Notice that this artwork by Dick Casciati shows the massive KC-135 dwarfing the B-52, pulling up in receiver pre-contact position. And the jet is in full afterburner, which of course it never had, but pretty darn dramatic. This is pre-contact as seen from the receiver aircraft, and you get that feeling of this massive 707 size airplane up there outside, ready to refuel your airplane. The Boeing 707 first went into service in October 1958. This is the Model 120, referred to as the straight pipe, and we'll tell you why in a moment. But this was the airplane that really changed the world and brought jet age travel, comfort, quietude, just a whole different experience. No vibration in the cabin, a very different way of flying. And this is the airplane that started it all. So here's the box top by noted LA illustrator Nixon Galloway, his only cover for Revell. Nick was a member of the famed Group West illustration studio here in LA. He was a pilot, also a sailor, just a really talented guy. And this was his depiction of the giant Boeing jetliner on the ground. So here's the direction sheet. Now let's take a look at the illustration. Of course, the copy there to the right, the history of your American Airlines 707 jet flagship with all the cool stuff about the airplane. But wait a minute, take a look at that illustration. Something's going on with that illustration that's different than what we saw on the cover. The nose radome of the 707 is all orange, like a DC-7. There's no black radome. And the engine pods, it's hard to tell. They don't look like they have thrust reversers or noise suppressors. But here's the reason why. In this era, all the model companies were scrambling to be the first ones to release a new kit. And what they had to work with many times were artist concepts of airplanes that weren't even built yet or definitely weren't flying yet, because it took the better part of a year from first concept to production of a brand new model. And so in this case, we have the sales brochure for the Boeing 707 jet stratoliner for Pan American with the clipper markings. The new markings from Raymond Loewy hadn't even been designed yet. And this is what the Revell artists had to work with. So here's the engines, just like the Dash 80 prototype. There's no reversers, no noise suppressors. But compare this to the real airplane. This is the Boeing 720 in American markings. But if you look out there on the wing, there's the noise suppressors, which gave the name straight pipe to these airplanes as opposed to the fan jets, which we're going to see in a moment. So lo and behold, what do? They actually add the noise suppressors onto the cover pretty dramatically and emphatically on this thing with the yellow highlights. But make no mistake, this is the current production airplane, like it or not. Okay, so just the way the 707 evolved from the KC-135, so did the model. And here's the KC-135 directions. Revell had an amazing approach to their direction sheet artwork. These are airbrushed renderings of pieces of the model, and they give you basic guidelines up at top there. Don't use too much cement, paint everything before you put it together, but they assume that you are a model builder, that you know what you're doing. This isn't the first time you've ever built a model kit of an airplane. So overall, it's a bit generic. They show you the pieces and how the halves go together, and that's all great. But it just assumes that you're kind of at the top of your game, and you need a little guidance as to how everything works. So here's the airline version of that same basic layout. A few modifications, obviously the markings. And let's take a look at the lower half. Again, the KC-135, and that evolves into the American 707. If you look at the upper illustration with the inverted model, look at those engines. And again, there's the basic potted engine, no reverser and no noise suppressors. But this is the final step of building your 707. And here's the finished model. Now, this is actually the later version, the fan-engined Astrojet. This is a kit that was re-released. Molds were modified from the original kit. This was released in 1962. But it gives you a good idea of how everything went together. It's a beautiful kit, really looks like the airplane. But there's a few odd things about this. If you look at the forward fuselage, there's 6 passenger windows and then a blank. I'll tell you what that is in a second. And then come on back to the trailing edge of the wing. There's a big gap there. And come back to the tail. There are 3 windows aft of the L2 door. Very odd, because in the real airplane, that's where the lavs are. Well, guess what? Looking at that brochure cover, the original location for the door on a 707 was just like the Stratocruiser or a DC-7. It was just after the wing. A good trick on a swept wing how to get the stairs in there, but that's another story. And then look at the tail. You've got an aft lounge back in the tail. This was the vogue in those days. You go back there and play cards. There was kind of a coffee table type arrangement. And there's the windows for the aft lounge. Well, when Revell did their kit, that's where they put those extra windows. But here's the actual airplane. So again, those 6 passenger windows up front and the blank, that is the bulkhead for what was then the first class club lounge. It was a curved sofa type arrangement. And again, people would meet up there. And that was a special area in the front part of the cabin. And that's why you see that blank window on the 707s. But again, nothing after the L2 door on the real airplane. Okay, now let's compare that to the Monogram Super G Connie. And I meant to mention that the logos for both Revell and Monogram employed an interesting color philosophy for kids. If you notice, kids' toys in the early years are generally primary colors, and both Revell and Monogram logos are red, yellow, and blue. Little history on the Connie. This started as a Army transport, first flew in 1943. And classic airplane, it was pressurized from the very first one, unlike the competing Douglas C-54 Skymaster, which was an unpressurized airplane. Douglas didn't have a pressurized airplane until the DC-6, which flew closer to 1948. Everybody talks about the trademark triple tail of the Connie, and I thought I'd spend a minute to talk about how that evolved. They didn't design the airplane as a triple-tailed airplane. Lockheed had a series of very successful transports that were twin tail, starting from the very first Lockheed 10 Electra, the Model 14, and the Model 18 Lodestar that you see here. And what they did on the Constellation is they took their trademark twin tail and added a central fin. And that's how they got the look. So here's the promotional photo of the very first Super G Connie. The airplane is named the United States. That name was just temporary for these publicity shots. And I want to call your attention to the size of the figures as they deplane from the airplane. Take a look at the ones on the boarding ramp walking away. And now look at the cover. Tiny little people. And this was in vogue in those days. This airplane is, 10 stories tall and 300 feet long. And these small figures are coming down the steps. But that's they did it with car ads. They did it with airplanes. It was a way to make everything look bigger and sleeker and grander than it actually was. This is a classic photo taken from the uh, deck of the tower there at Kansas City. And they added the boarding stairs, and this became the lead photo for the Monogram direction sheet. This kit was introduced in 1957. The Revell 707 was a year later, but these airplanes overlapped in terms of their operational service. So here we have the Monogram sheet, and this is a whole different ballgame. This assumes that you have never built a model before and you need to know every single thing about it. At the top there, it says, study this exploded drawing and become familiar with every part, where it goes and how it fits with other parts before you begin assembly. Really? Wow. I'll give you a minute. Just kidding. But the artwork on these on the Monogram direction sheets was absolutely stunning. It was a technique where they used a line drawing, and then the tone was added by mechanical sheets. It was called zipatone, and they would cut out these patterns of crosshatch or whatever to give the shading to the shapes and the form and structure of the model. And this was done throughout the direction sheet. Very complex, very tedious, and quite stunning to look at. And then there were these guys. Now, on the Monogram sheets, you'd always see these hands of the guys putting on the decals flawlessly. Notice it's not wrapping around his fingers. And there's the water on the left, in case you wondered how that worked. But it gave you everything you needed to know about putting on the decals. And then there was this guy painting the leading edge de-icer boot on the tail fin with such precision that went right to the edge. Mine sure didn't look like that. And it reminds me of the famous line from Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. When I look at these illustrations, who are these guys? All right, here's your easy step-by-step assembly instructions. And you put the halves together, you put the decals on first, which I thought was odd because you're handling the model. So that was pretty risky, but it shows you everything you need to know. And here's step 1 and 2 and 3 and 4. And wow, here's more stuff. And you can use rubber bands to hold the wing halves together, and how to put the props on with the little retaining cap. And uh, oh gosh, there's even more landing gear and everything you need to know. Put the windshield in there, and wow, the boarding ladders, it just keeps going. This is not a kit you would build in an afternoon on a Saturday at the dining room table. There's some pretty complex stuff. And finally, you put the boarding stairs in to hold the tail up, and your model is finished. And when it's done and done well, it looks like this. Special shout out to my dear friend Craig Cadera, who built this build up and took the photo. This is called out of the box. It means literally using the parts and pieces and the decals to create the finished product, which looks just like this. Well, there you have it. I hope you enjoyed this comparison of Revell and Monogram direction sheets. We have plenty more to come. This is going to become a series. And thank you again for celebrating aviation with Mike Machat. Special thanks to some very dear friends who helped make this possible. We'll see you next time.